In September of 1903, a salvage diver named August Herold descended into Lake Michigan approximately 11 miles off the coast of Chicago and did not surface for 47 minutes. When he came up, he did not speak. His assistant, a younger man named Carl Weston, who had worked dives with Herold for 6 years, wrote in his logbook that Herold climbed over the side of the tender boat, sat down on a coil of rope, and stared at the floor of the deck for a long time without removing his helmet. When Weston finally pulled the helmet off, Herold told him to bring the boat back to port. He did not describe what he had seen at depth. He did not file a salvage report for the dive. And 3 days later, on September 19, 1903, the United States Navy issued a navigational restriction on a 30-mile corridor of southern Lake Michigan that remained in effect for 30 days. No official explanation was given for the restriction. No newspaper reported on it at the time, and August Herold never dived again. I came to this while reading shipping records. I was trying to understand the pattern of commercial disruption on the Great Lakes during the early 1900s, the period when industrial expansion along the Chicago waterfront was changing the economics of the lake trade, and I kept encountering a gap in the September and October 1903 freight logs from the Chicago Port Authority. Ships that should have been running the Southern Lake Corridor during those 30 days weren't running it. They were rerouted north, through the Straits of Mackinac, adding days and considerable cost to routes that had no obvious reason to change. I put the rerouting records next to the Navy's navigational register for that year. The restriction was listed. The reason field was blank, not redacted, blank. As though whoever filled in the register had left a space for an explanation and never returned to complete it. By the time this is over, you will understand what August Herold found on the floor of Lake Michigan in September 1903, why the Navy's response came within 72 hours of his ascent, and why the thing he found has not appeared in any public account of what lies beneath that lake in the centuries since. But to understand why what he found was impossible, you have to understand what should have been down there and what shouldn't. Lake Michigan in 1903 was a working lake. It was not a mysterious one. The southern basin, where Herold was diving, had been commercially navigated for the better part of a century. The shipping lanes were charted. The bottom had been surveyed repeatedly, first by the Army Corps of Engineers in the 1870s, again in 1889 as part of a harbor deepening project for the Chicago port, and again in 1897 following a series of groundings that suggested the bathymetric charts were out of date. By 1903, the bottom topography of the Southern Lake Corridor was, according to those surveys, well understood. Sandy substrate, averaging between 50 and 90 feet of depth in the area where Herold was working, with 2 known features of note. The wreck of the schooner Hippocampus, lost in an 1871 storm, and a limestone shelf formation running northeast to southwest at approximately 63 feet that the 1889 survey had mapped in detail. There was nothing else. There was nothing down there that a working diver in 1903 should not have been able to account for. This is the part I keep returning to. Because Herold was not an amateur. He was 41 years old, a commercial salvage diver with 16 years of documented work on the Great Lakes, trained in the hard hat diving method that had been standard practice on the lakes since the 1880s. He had worked wrecks in Lake Superior, recovered cargo from Lake Erie, and spent more time on the floors of the Great Lakes than almost any civilian diver of his generation. The hard hat diving of that period was a precise, methodical practice. A diver wearing a copper helmet and canvas suit. Air pumped down from the tender boat through an India rubber hose, weighted to descend at a controlled rate, carrying a lamp and a line to communicate with the surface by coded tugs. A diver at 78 feet in 1903 had perhaps 20 to 30 minutes of working time before air supply and decompression margins required ascent. Harold stayed down for 47. That exceeds the safe working window for that depth by any calculation I can make using the decompression tables of the period. He should have had symptoms of nitrogen narcosis, at minimum, possibly worse. And yet Weston does not describe him as disoriented or physically distressed. He describes him as still, unnervingly still, in the way that a person is still when they have seen something they cannot yet begin to process. Weston's logbook, which I found in a collection of maritime records donated to the Newberry Library in Chicago by Weston's granddaughter in 1984, describes Harold as a man of extraordinary composure underwater. Weston writes that in 6 years of working together he had never seen Harold surface early from a dive, never seen him fail to file a report, and never seen him refuse to discuss what he had found. The September 19th dive was all three at once. The logbook entry for that day is brief. Weston records the descent time, the depth reached, which he notes is 78 feet, significantly deeper than the charted bottom depth for that location, and the duration. Then, he writes a single sentence that I have read many times and cannot parse into anything innocent. He writes that when Harold's helmet came off, the man smelled of something Weston did not recognize, and that his hands were shaking in a way they had never shaken before. That is the complete entry. The next page of the logbook covers a different dive, on a different date, on a different part of the lake. Whatever Weston knew or suspected about the September 19th descent, he chose not to put more of it in writing. Harold gave one account of the dive, not to a newspaper, not to the Navy, not to any official body. He gave it to his brother-in-law, a machinist named Peter Drosty who lived in Milwaukee, in a letter written approximately 10 days after the dive, and approximately 3 weeks before the Navy's navigational restriction was lifted. The letter was kept by Drosty's family and passed through 2 generations before a great-grandchild donated a collection of family papers to the Milwaukee County Historical Society in 1971. The letter was catalogued under Drost, Peter, Correspondence, Personal, Miscellaneous. I requested it on the basis of a footnote reference in a 1989 dissertation on Great Lakes commercial diving history, which cited the letter's existence without quoting from it. The dissertation's author, a graduate student at the University of Wisconsin, had found the catalog entry and requested the letter, but had been told it was unavailable due to conservation concerns. By the time I requested it, 35 years later, it had been digitized. No one had requested it in the intervening period. The letter runs to 4 pages in Harold's hand. 3 of those pages cover ordinary matters, family news, a dispute with a client over a salvage fee, the cost of replacing equipment. The 4th page is different. Harold begins it by telling Drosty that he is writing down what he saw because he does not want to forget the details, and because he is not certain he will be allowed to discuss it openly for much longer. That sentence is the first indication in the letter that anything unusual has occurred. What follows is a description that I will characterize as carefully as I can, because Harold was a practical man and a precise one, and he was not given to exaggeration in any other part of the letter. He writes that when he reached 78 feet beyond the charted bottom depth, in water that should not have had a floor that deep, he found a surface beneath him that was not sand and was not limestone shelf. He writes that it was flat, artificially flat in his assessment, in the same way that a poured concrete floor is flat, rather than the way that natural substrate is flat. He writes that it extended in both directions as far as his lamp reached, roughly 15 feet in the sediment-clouded water, and that it was partially covered in a layer of silt that had accumulated over what he judged, from his experience with wreck debris, to be a very long time. He writes that there were features protruding from the silt along one edge of the flat surface, regular in their spacing, he noted, roughly 6 feet apart, that he could not identify as any structural element he had encountered in 16 years of salvage work. He writes that he followed the edge of the flat surface for approximately 40 feet before his air supply and time margins required him to ascend. And he writes one final thing, that at the point where he turned to begin his ascent, his lamp illuminated what he describes as an opening in the flat surface, descending further into darkness he could not see the bottom of. Not wreckage, not geological formation, a flat floor, regular protrusions, and a descending opening at 78 feet in water that the most recent survey said should have had a sandy bottom at 63. Consider what the Navy's response looked like from the outside. A 30-day navigational restriction on a major commercial corridor, issued with no explanation, at a cost to shipping operators that the freight rerouting records suggest ran into several $1,000s per affected vessel. The restriction was issued by the 9th Naval District, headquartered in Chicago, which had jurisdiction over Great Lakes waters. I requested the 9th Naval District's administrative records for September and October 1903 through the National Archives. The file for that period is present. The navigational restriction order is in the file. The supporting documentation for the order, the assessment, the authorization, whatever chain of internal communication produced the decision, is not. The file notes, in a hand different from the surrounding documents and in a slightly different ink, that supporting materials were transferred to the Office of Naval Intelligence in November 1903. I submitted a request to the Naval Intelligence records held at the National Archives. The relevant file, if it exists, is not in the publicly accessible collection. The archivist I spoke with told me that Naval Intelligence records from before 1910 are incompletely transferred, and that gaps of this kind are common. He was helpful, and he was probably right. I have not been able to determine whether that is the complete explanation. What happened to August Herold after October 1903 is documented in enough detail to be certain of the basic facts. He did not return to commercial diving. He settled a salvage contract dispute through an intermediary rather than pursuing it personally, which suggests he had decided to withdraw from the business rather than defend his professional standing in it. He moved from Chicago to a small town in central Wisconsin in early 1904, where he worked as a warehouse manager for a grain distributor until his retirement in 1921. The Weston logbook records no further dives after September 1903. Carl Weston continued diving commercially for another 11 years and, according to a brief profile published in a Chicago Maritime Trade Journal in 1914, became one of the most respected salvage divers on the lake. The profile does not mention the September 1903 dive or the 30-day restriction. It does not mention Herold at all. The letter to Drosty ends with a paragraph that I have returned to more times than I can count. Herold writes that he does not know what he found on the floor of Lake Michigan. He writes that he has tried to fit it into every category of thing he knows how to think about. A wreck, a geological feature, a man-made structure from the recent industrial period, and that none of those categories accommodate what his lamp showed him at 78 feet. He writes that he is not a man who frightens easily, and that what frightened him was not what he saw, but the fact that it was there. That something could be there, at that depth, in a lake that had been surveyed 3 times in 30 years, and that no survey had found it. That implies either that the surveys were wrong, or that what he found was not there when the surveys were conducted, or that what he found was there but was not the kind of thing the surveys were designed to find. He does not choose among those possibilities. He writes that he is not qualified to choose. And then he asks Drosty not to discuss the letter with anyone, and he closes. There is a documented geological survey of the southern Lake Michigan Basin, conducted in 1926 by the United States Geological Survey, that covers the area where Harold dived. The survey charts show the bottom depth in that corridor at between 60 and 67 feet. 78 feet of depth is not recorded anywhere in the survey. Neither is any flat structural surface, any regular feature spacing, any descending opening. The area is mapped as unremarkable sandy bottom, consistent with every survey before and after it. I have no explanation for the discrepancy between what those surveys recorded and what Harold described finding. I have not been able to find one that satisfies me. The Lake Michigan Basin holds somewhere between 100 and 200 known shipwrecks, depending on the classification criteria, spread across its entire length. The southern basin, around the area Harold was working, holds fewer than a dozen documented wrecks from before 1903. None of them match what Harold described. And none of the wreck databases I have consulted, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's records, the Great Lakes Shipwreck Historical Society's archive, the Maritime Heritage Program listings, contain any entry corresponding to a flat man-made surface at 78 feet in that corridor. If it was ever cataloged under any official designation, that designation has not found its way into any publicly searchable record. And Lake Michigan is not alone in this. When I began looking for comparable cases, commercial divers in the Great Lakes period who surfaced from unexpected depths, followed by unusual naval or governmental response, I found two others that I cannot explain away. In 1897, a diving crew working a cable-laying survey in Lake Superior reported to the contractor, in a written account preserved in a Minnesota Railroad archive, that their depth soundings in a section of the Western Basin consistently returned readings of 30 feet greater than the Admiralty charts showed. They ran the soundings 3 times. The discrepancy held each time. The contractor reported the anomaly to the Army Corps of Engineers. The Corps sent a survey vessel the following month and returned charts that matched the original Admiralty figures. No explanation for the discrepancy was given. The contractor's written account ends with a note, in a different hand from the rest of the document, that reads, "Confirmed no error in original survey equipment." That notation is undated and unsigned. In 1911, a diver named Thomas Vreeland, working the northern shore of Lake Erie, submitted a salvage claim for wrecked debris recovered from a location he specified as 104 feet, 11 feet deeper than the bathymetric chart for that location. The Lake Erie District Harbormaster's office initially rejected the claim on the grounds that the depth coordinates he provided did not correspond to any charted depth in the area. Vreeland appealed. The appeal was eventually settled, but the Harbormaster's records show that the settlement was contingent on Vreeland amending the coordinates in his claim to match the charted depth. He amended them. The salvage claim was paid. What he actually recovered from 104 feet, under a coordinate that the official record now lists as 83, is not described in any document I have found. The floor of Lake Michigan is still there. The surveys are still there. The letter to Peter Droste is still there, in the Milwaukee County Historical Society, digitized and cataloged, and available to anyone who knows to ask for it. What is not there is the 30 days of Navy records that would tell us what they found when they sent their own divers down after Harold came up shaking and smelling of something his partner of 6 years could not name. Those records went to the Office of Naval Intelligence in November 1903, and whatever the Office of Naval Intelligence decided about what was on the floor of that lake, they kept it in a file that has not been made public in the 120 years since. The navigational restriction was lifted on October 19th. Commercial shipping resumed the southern corridor. The freight logs from the following week showed traffic returning to normal within 3 days, as though nothing had interrupted it. As though the 30 days had simply been a weather delay, a seasonal adjustment. A gap in the record too small to require explanation, and no one who was on the lake during those 30 days, no shipping operator, no harbor master's assistant, no naval rating who might have crewed the vessels that were presumably operating in the restricted zone during that period, left any account in any archive I have been able to reach of what they saw or what they were told. If you know someone who has spent time on the Great Lakes, who has worked those waters, dived them, studied them, share this with them. Not because there is a clean answer waiting below the surface. There isn't. But because August Harold descended into water that should have had a sandy floor at 63 feet, found something at 78 feet that he could not name after 16 years of working the lakes, and was careful enough and frightened enough to write it down before he went quiet for the rest of his life. He knew what wrecks looked like. He knew what geology looked like. He knew what the work of human hands looked like underwater. And what he found on that September morning in 1903 was none of those things, and all of them at once, and it was flat, and it went down, and the Navy sealed the water above it for 30 days, and then took the paperwork somewhere it has never come back from.